The photograph slipped from between the pages of my uncle's journal like a confession finally demanding to be heard. I'd been looking for his spare reading glasses, something mundane, something innocent, when the manila envelope tucked behind his medical text caught my attention. Inside, dozens of photographs spanning decades, all featuring young women who looked remarkably similar to Sarah. My hands trembled as I spread them across his mahogany desk. Different hairstyles, different decades of fashion, but the same bone structure, the same curious tilt of the head, the same searching eyes that had first drawn me to Sarah 6 months ago. Each photograph was meticulously labeled in my uncle's precise handwriting. Dates, locations, and a single word that made my blood freeze. Curious. The journal entry I found beneath them was dated 3 days after I'd brought Sarah home to meet my family. Dr. Marcus Webb, my father's brother, had written with the clinical detachment that had made him one of the city's most respected psychiatrists. Asterisk subject exhibits classic pattern of intellectual curiosity masquerading as romantic interest. Physical markers consistent with previous cases. High forehead indicating analytical capacity, restless hand movements suggesting need for stimulation, eye contact patterns revealing assessment rather than attraction. Recommended intervention proceeded as planned. Asterisk I sat in his leather chair, surrounded by evidence of something I couldn't yet comprehend, while the grandfather clock in the corner marked time with mechanical precision. Each tick seemed to echo the same question that had been growing in my mind since that day 3 months ago when Uncle Marcus had taken Sarah aside for their private conversation. What had he told her during those 20 minutes in his study? And why had she been different afterward, still loving, still present, but somehow observing me with the detached interest of a researcher studying a particularly fascinating specimen? The journal's final entry was dated yesterday. Asterisk experiment approaching natural conclusion. Subject's curiosity has been satisfied. Termination phase will commence as predicted. Daniel remains unaware of his role in the larger study. Consider this case closed. Asterisk I heard Sarah's key in the front door of my apartment, the soft sound that had once meant safety and homecoming. Now it sounded like the final movement of a symphony I'd been unconsciously conducting for months, playing my part in someone else's composition without ever seeing the score. The perfect introduction. The first time I saw Sarah Martinez, she was arguing with a librarian about the philosophical implications of cataloging systems. Most people would have found the scene pretentious or odd, but I was fascinated by the intensity of her conviction that organizational structures reflected hidden power dynamics. She stood among the towering stacks of the university library, gesticulating with scholarly passion about how the Dewey Decimal System perpetuated intellectual hierarchies. I'd been researching my senior thesis on urban planning and social psychology, but Sarah's animated discourse on information architecture proved far more compelling than my pile of academic journals. When she finally noticed my attention, her response wasn't embarrassment or flirtation. It was genuine curiosity about whether I'd been listening to understand or merely to judge. That curiosity became the defining characteristic of our relationship. Sarah approached everything with the methodical fascination of a scientist discovering new phenomena. She studied the way I organized my apartment with anthropological interest, asked probing questions about my childhood memories that revealed psychological insights I'd never considered, and observed my daily routines with the attention of someone mapping previously uncharted territory. At first, I found her analytical nature charming. Sarah made me feel like the most interesting person in the world, worthy of comprehensive investigation. She remembered details about my preferences that even close friends had never noticed, drew connections between my behaviors and motivations that displayed remarkable emotional intelligence, and approached our relationship with the kind of thoughtful intentionality that made every interaction feel meaningful. We'd been dating for 3 months when I finally decided to introduce her to my family. The occasion was my uncle's 60th birthday celebration, held at the restored Victorian mansion that had been in the Webb family for 4 generations. Uncle Marcus had raised me after my parents died in a car accident when I was 16, and his approval meant everything to me. The party was typical of my uncle's social gatherings. Carefully curated guest lists of medical colleagues, academic associates, and cultural luminaries who engaged in the kind of elevated conversation that had shaped my intellectual development. I was proud to introduce Sarah to this world, confident that her scholarly interests and analytical mind would impress the distinguished company. Sarah moved through the evening with graceful confidence, engaging doctors in discussions about the intersection of psychology and urban planning, charming professors with her insights into information theory, and demonstrating the kind of intellectual sophistication that I'd hoped would earn my uncle's respect. She seemed perfectly suited to the environment, as if she'd been preparing for exactly this kind of social performance. Uncle Marcus observed these interactions with his characteristic clinical attention to detail. As the city's most prominent psychiatrist, he possessed an uncanny ability to assess personality types and psychological motivations within minutes of meeting someone. I'd seen him accurately diagnose relationship problems, predict behavioral patterns, and offer therapeutic insights that proved remarkably prescient. Halfway through the evening, he approached us near the library where Sarah had been examining his collection of first-edition psychology texts. The setting felt appropriate. My uncle surrounded by the tools of his profession, Sarah engrossed in academic materials that revealed her intellectual curiosity, and me standing between them like a bridge connecting two worlds I hoped would appreciate each other. Uncle Marcus studied Sarah with the same focused attention he brought to his most challenging cases. His evaluation wasn't subtle. He assessed her responses, body language, and conversational patterns with professional intensity that would have intimidated most people. But Sarah seemed fascinated rather than uncomfortable, meeting his analytical gaze with curious interest rather than defensive retreat. The exchange that followed would replay in my memory countless times over the coming months, each repetition revealing new layers of meaning I'd initially missed. "You're studying information architecture," Uncle Marcus observed, his voice carrying the measured tone he used for initial patient assessments. "Among other things," Sarah replied with a smile that seemed both genuine and somehow calculated. "I'm interested in how organizational systems reflect and shape human behavior." Fascinating field. "And what draws you to Daniel specifically?" "He's quite different from the usual subjects of academic curiosity." The word subjects struck me as oddly clinical, but Sarah's response suggested she found the terminology perfectly natural. "Daniel represents an interesting case study in environmental psychology," she said, glancing at me with what I interpreted as affection but Uncle Marcus seemed to recognize as something else entirely. His responses to social structures and relationship dynamics reveal patterns that aren't immediately obvious. They continued their conversation while I stood beside them, increasingly aware that I was being discussed rather than included in the dialogue. Their exchange had the quality of professional consultation, as if they were colleagues analyzing a shared research interest rather than strangers meeting for the first time. Uncle Marcus nodded thoughtfully, his expression suggesting both understanding and concern. "Curiosity is a powerful motivator," he said finally, his words seeming to carry weight beyond their surface meaning. "But it's important to consider the ethical implications of studying people who aren't aware they're being observed." Sarah's reaction was subtle but telling, a slight tightening around her eyes, a momentary pause that suggested recognition of hidden meaning. Uncle Marcus had communicated something to her in that moment, something that required no further explanation because they shared a common understanding I wasn't privy to. The conversation ended with Uncle Marcus extending an invitation that would prove far more significant than I realized at the time. "Sarah, I'd love to continue our discussion about information systems and human behavior. Would you join me in my study for a few minutes? I have some materials that might interest you." She accepted immediately, following him toward the oak-paneled room where he conducted his private practice. I remained in the library, assuming they would discuss academic theories and professional insights that might benefit Sarah's research. The 20 minutes they spent behind closed doors seemed reasonable for a mentoring conversation between an established professional and a promising graduate student. When they emerged, both wore expressions of satisfied understanding, as if they'd reached important conclusions about matters that had previously been unclear. Sarah seemed energized by whatever they discussed, while Uncle Marcus appeared pleased to have provided valuable guidance to a young scholar. But something fundamental had shifted during those 20 minutes. Sarah's attention toward me maintained its intensity, but the quality of that attention had changed in ways I couldn't immediately identify. She continued asking probing questions about my thoughts and feelings, but her inquiries felt more systematic, more purposeful than before. I attributed the change to academic excitement. Sarah had connected with a respected professional in a field related to her interests, and that intellectual stimulation naturally influenced her approach to other aspects of her life. The idea that my uncle might have shared insights that changed how she viewed our relationship never seriously occurred to me, not until months later, when I discovered evidence that forced me to reconstruct everything I thought I knew about that evening. The ride home from the party established a new dynamic between us. Sarah asked questions about my childhood in Uncle Marcus's house, my relationship with him since my parents' death, and my feelings about being raised by someone whose profession involved analyzing human behavior. Her inquiries had a systematic quality that suggested she was gathering specific information rather than making casual conversation. I answered her questions openly, grateful for someone who seemed genuinely interested in understanding my background and family relationships. Sarah's curiosity felt like love expressed through intellectual engagement, and I interpreted her systematic approach as evidence of her commitment to truly knowing me. Over the following weeks, our relationship deepened in ways that felt both natural and somehow orchestrated. Sarah began spending more time at my apartment, observing my daily routines with fascinated attention. She asked detailed questions about my decision-making processes, emotional responses to various situations, and the psychological patterns I'd developed as coping mechanisms for early trauma. Her fascination with my mental processes should have felt intrusive, but instead it made me feel valued and understood. No one had ever shown such comprehensive interest in my psychological landscape. Sarah's attention was flattering in its thoroughness, and I mistook systematic observation for intimate devotion. She also began introducing subtle changes to our routine that seemed designed to test my adaptability and response patterns. Suggestions for different restaurants became experiments in how I handled unfamiliar social environments. Gifts of books and music revealed how I processed new cultural inputs. Even her physical affection carried an observational quality, as if she were documenting my emotional and physical responses for some larger purpose. But these patterns only became clear in retrospect. At the time, I experienced Sarah's systematic approach as the natural evolution of a deepening relationship. Her analytical nature complemented my own introspective tendencies, creating what felt like intellectual and emotional compatibility. The first hint that something might be amiss came 6 weeks after the party, when I mentioned casually that I'd been thinking about calling Uncle Marcus to thank him for the career advice he'd given Sarah during their private conversation. Career advice? Sarah looked genuinely confused for a moment before her expression shifted to something more guarded. Oh, right. Yes, he was very helpful with professional insights. Her response felt evasive in a way that didn't match her usual directness, but I dismissed my unease as paranoid sensitivity. Sarah was entitled to private conversations and professional relationships that didn't require my complete understanding. It wasn't until I found the photographs and journal entries 3 months later that I realized Sarah's confusion hadn't been about remembering the conversation. It had been about remembering which version of that conversation she was supposed to share with me. The systematic approach Sarah's transformation after the party was subtle enough that I initially attributed it to natural relationship progression, but systematic enough that I eventually recognized it as something more deliberate. She began documenting our interactions with what seemed like academic thoroughness, taking notes in a leather journal she carried everywhere and photographing seemingly mundane moments of our daily life together. When I asked about the documentation, Sarah explained it as part of her graduate research methodology. She was developing a thesis about intimate relationships as information systems, studying how couples create and maintain shared databases of knowledge about each other. The concept seemed plausible and intellectually sophisticated, exactly the kind of innovative approach I'd expect from someone with her analytical mind. The photographs she took revealed her systematic approach to observation. Sarah captured me in moments of unconscious behavior, reading morning newspaper, organizing my workspace, interacting with neighbors, even sleeping. She claimed these images would help her analyze behavioral patterns and environmental influences on personal routine formation, but the collection felt more comprehensive than casual academic interest would require. Her questions about my past became increasingly specific and probing. Sarah wanted detailed accounts of my childhood trauma, my relationship with Uncle Marcus, my educational experiences, and my professional aspirations. She approached these conversations with interview-like preparation, often returning to topics we'd previously discussed to clarify details or explore inconsistencies in my recollections. I appreciated her thorough interest in my psychological development, interpreting her systematic approach as evidence of deep emotional investment in understanding who I was and how I'd become that person. Sarah's questions helped me examine aspects of my own experience that I'd never fully processed, and her analytical insights often revealed patterns I hadn't consciously recognized. But her methodology extended beyond conversation into behavioral observation and subtle experimentation. Sarah would introduce small changes to our routine or environment, then carefully monitor my responses. She might rearrange items in my apartment to see if I noticed, suggest activities outside my comfort zone to test my adaptability, or create minor conflicts to observe my conflict resolution strategies. These experiments felt like natural relationship dynamics at the time. Couples naturally influence each other's environments and challenge each other's boundaries as part of growing closer. Sarah's interventions seemed loving rather than manipulative, designed to help me expand my experiences and examine my assumptions. She also began introducing me to her friends and colleagues. But these social interactions had an observational quality that I didn't immediately recognize as unusual. Sarah's academic circle included other graduate students in psychology, sociology, and information science, and our gatherings often felt like informal research meetings where I was the primary subject of discussion. They would ask detailed questions about my background, profession, and relationship with Sarah, then engage in theoretical discussions about personality types, attachment styles, and behavioral patterns that seemed to reference my responses without explicitly acknowledging they were analyzing me. The conversations were intellectually stimulating, but I gradually realized I was being studied rather than simply included in their social circle. Sarah's physical affection also took on qualities of documentation and experimentation. She paid meticulous attention to my responses to different types of touch, remembered my reactions to various forms of intimacy with scientific precision, and seemed to be mapping my emotional and physical responsiveness with systematic thoroughness. Even our sexual relationship began feeling like research, though Sarah maintained emotional warmth that disguised the analytical undertones. She would try different approaches and carefully observe my reactions, ask detailed questions about my preferences and boundaries, and seemed to be gathering data about my psychological and physical responses to various stimuli. The cumulative effect was a relationship that felt intensely intimate and somehow impersonal simultaneously. Sarah knew me better than anyone ever had, but her knowledge felt clinical rather than romantic. She could predict my behaviors, understand my motivations, and anticipate my needs with remarkable accuracy, but her insights came from systematic observation rather than emotional intuition. 2 months after the party, Sarah suggested we spend a weekend at her family's cabin in the mountains. The retreat would give us uninterrupted time together away from urban distractions, allowing us to deepen our connection without the usual social and professional obligations that limited our availability to each other. The cabin was perfectly isolated, surrounded by dense forest with no cellular service or internet connectivity. Sarah had prepared meticulously for the weekend, bringing supplies, entertainment, and research materials that suggested she planned to use our time for more than romantic bonding. During our first evening there, Sarah introduced what she called relationship mapping exercises designed to help us understand our communication patterns and emotional dynamics. The activities involved detailed questionnaires, role-playing scenarios, and systematic discussions about our individual psychological profiles and compatibility factors. I participated enthusiastically, grateful for structured opportunities to explore our relationship with intellectual rigor. Sarah's academic approach to emotional intimacy appealed to my own analytical nature, and the exercises seemed like sophisticated tools for building deeper understanding between us. But the weekend's activities extended far beyond typical relationship building. Sarah documented our interactions with video recordings, conducted formal interviews about my childhood and family relationships, and administered what seemed like psychological assessments disguised as relationship games. She also introduced experimental scenarios designed to test my responses to various forms of stress, uncertainty, and conflict. Sarah would create situations that challenged my comfort zone, then carefully observe and document my coping strategies, emotional reactions, and behavioral adaptations. By Sunday evening, I felt like I'd been through comprehensive psychological evaluation rather than a romantic retreat. Sarah had gathered extensive data about my personality, behavioral patterns, emotional triggers, and psychological vulnerabilities. The information would have been valuable for anyone seeking to understand or influence my behavior in systematic ways. The drive home was quiet, with Sarah reviewing her notes and seeming to process the weekend's findings with scientific satisfaction. She had achieved whatever research objectives she'd established for our time together, and her sense of accomplishment was evident in her relaxed demeanor and pleased expression. But I felt exhausted and somehow exposed, as if essential aspects of my identity had been cataloged and filed away for future reference. The intimate knowledge Sarah had gained about me felt less like romantic closeness and more like professional intelligence gathering. That night, after Sarah had returned to her own apartment, I found myself questioning the weekend's activities with growing unease. The systematic nature of her approach, the comprehensive scope of her documentation, and the clinical quality of her observations suggested purposes beyond relationship building. I began reviewing our entire relationship through this new lens of suspicion, recognizing patterns I'd previously interpreted as love but might actually represent systematic study. Sarah's curiosity about my psychological landscape, her methodical approach to understanding my behavioral patterns, and her careful documentation of our interactions suddenly seemed less romantic and more research-oriented. The possibility that I was being studied rather than loved created a fundamental shift in how I interpreted Sarah's behavior. Her systematic attention, analytical questions, and observational thoroughness might represent academic interest rather than emotional investment. The idea was disturbing enough that I tried to dismiss it as paranoid insecurity rather than legitimate concern. But doubt, once planted, proved impossible to ignore. I began paying closer attention to Sarah's methodology, looking for evidence that would either confirm or dispel my growing suspicions about her true motivations for maintaining our relationship. The growing doubt the evidence accumulated gradually, like symptoms of an illness I didn't want to acknowledge. Sarah's systematic approach to our relationship began revealing itself as something more calculated than passionate, more professional than personal. Small details that I'd previously overlooked started forming a pattern that suggested purposes beyond romantic connection. Her apartment contained far more documentation about me than seemed natural for a girlfriend. Sarah kept detailed files of our conversations, photographs organized by date and behavioral category, and what appeared to be psychological profiles written in academic terminology. When I asked about the materials, she explained them as part of her graduate research on intimate relationships as information systems, but the scope and specificity suggested more focused objectives. Sarah's questions about my childhood with Uncle Marcus became increasingly probing and specific. She wanted detailed accounts of his therapeutic techniques, his approach to treating adolescent trauma, and his methods for helping me develop coping strategies after my parents' death. Her interest in my uncle's professional practices seemed disproportionate to casual curiosity about my upbringing. She also began asking about other family members, childhood friends, and formative relationships in ways that suggested she was mapping my complete psychological development rather than simply getting to know my background. Sarah's inquiries felt like intake interviews rather than intimate conversations, comprehensive rather than conversational. The most unsettling development was her apparent familiarity with psychological concepts and therapeutic techniques that exceeded what I would expect from her stated academic focus on information architecture. Sarah demonstrated sophisticated understanding of trauma response patterns, attachment theory, and behavioral modification strategies that suggested either extensive psychological training or access to professional consultation. When I mentioned these observations, Sarah acknowledged having taken psychology courses as electives and having consulted with professionals in various fields as part of her interdisciplinary research approach. Her explanations were plausible but didn't fully account for the depth and specificity of her psychological insights. I also began noticing inconsistencies in her accounts of our relationship timeline and development. Sarah sometimes referenced conversations we'd supposedly had that I couldn't remember, or described my behavioral patterns in ways that seemed more analytical than observational. Her knowledge of my psychological responses was remarkably comprehensive for someone who'd known me only 6 months. The weekend at the cabin had produced extensive documentation that Sarah seemed reluctant to share with me despite its focus on our relationship dynamics. When I asked to review the materials, she explained that raw research data wouldn't be meaningful without proper analysis and interpretation, but her evasiveness suggested other reasons for maintaining exclusive access to information about me. 3 months after Uncle Marcus's party, I decided to visit him unannounced to discuss my growing concerns about Sarah's research methods and apparent psychological expertise. I needed professional perspective on whether her systematic approach to our relationship was within normal parameters or suggested something more problematic. Uncle Marcus received me in his home study, the same oak-paneled room where he'd conducted his private conversation with Sarah. The setting felt appropriate for discussing my concerns about her research ethics and potential boundary violations, but his response to my questions revealed unexpected complexities. "Daniel, I'm glad you came to talk with me about this," he said with the careful tone he used for sensitive therapeutic discussions. "Your observations about Sarah's methodology are quite astute." His acknowledgement that my concerns were legitimate was both validating and alarming. Uncle Marcus rarely confirmed suspicions about interpersonal dynamics without substantial evidence supporting those concerns. "Is her behavior unethical?" I asked directly. "Should I be worried about being treated as a research subject without proper consent?" Uncle Marcus studied me with professional assessment that reminded me uncomfortably of how Sarah often observed my responses to challenging questions. "The ethical implications depend largely on her intentions and your level of informed consent," he replied carefully. "Research involving intimate relationships occupies complex territory where professional and personal boundaries often become blurred." His response was therapeutically neutral but contained implications that increased rather than alleviated my concerns. Uncle Marcus seemed to know more about Sarah's research methods than casual conversation with her would have revealed. "What did you discuss with her during your private conversation at the party?" I asked, recognizing that their interaction might hold keys to understanding her subsequent behavior toward me. Uncle Marcus hesitated before responding, his expression suggesting internal debate about professional discretion versus family loyalty. "Sarah approached our conversation with very specific questions about your psychological development and trauma recovery," he said finally. "Her knowledge of therapeutic techniques and assessment methods was quite sophisticated for someone whose academic focus is supposedly information architecture." The revelation that Sarah had initiated their conversation with prepared questions about my psychological profile fundamentally changed how I understood that evening. She hadn't been introduced to my uncle as my girlfriend meeting my family. She'd approached him as a researcher seeking professional consultation about her subject. "What kind of questions?" I pressed, needing to understand the scope of Sarah's investigation into my psychological landscape. "Questions about your attachment patterns, emotional regulation strategies, responses to authority figures, and susceptibility to various forms of influence," Uncle Marcus replied with obvious reluctance. The inquiry suggested familiarity with diagnostic criteria and therapeutic assessment protocols. The clinical specificity of Sarah's interests revealed the extent of her systematic approach to studying me. She hadn't been casually curious about my psychology. She'd been conducting comprehensive evaluation of my personality structure and behavioral predictability. "Did you answer her questions?" I asked, though I suspected I already knew the response. "I provided general information about adolescent trauma recovery and therapeutic approaches," Uncle Marcus replied carefully, "but I was concerned about her apparent lack of ethical oversight for what seemed to be unauthorized psychological research." His acknowledgement that he'd shared information about my therapeutic treatment, even in general terms, felt like a violation of the trust and confidentiality that had been essential to my recovery from childhood trauma. Uncle Marcus had served as both guardian and therapist during my adolescence, and our relationship had been built on absolute professional discretion. "Why didn't you warn me about her research interests?" I asked, struggling to understand why he would facilitate Sarah's investigation rather than protecting my privacy. Uncle Marcus's expression shifted to something more complex, suggesting internal conflict between professional obligations and personal concerns. "I believed her research might serve beneficial purposes," he said slowly. "Understanding how individuals with your psychological profile navigate intimate relationships could provide valuable insights for therapeutic practice." The implication that I represented a useful case study for advancing psychological understanding was deeply disturbing. Uncle Marcus seemed to view my relationship with Sarah as an opportunity for research rather than a potential threat to my emotional well-being. "So you encouraged her systematic study of me?" I asked, needing explicit confirmation of what seemed increasingly obvious. I suggested that her research could be conducted ethically with proper oversight and informed consent, Uncle Marcus replied. "I also provided her with resources and professional contacts that might help her develop more rigorous methodology." The revelation that my uncle had actively facilitated Sarah's research by providing professional resources and guidance was devastating. The two most important people in my life had collaborated to treat me as a subject for psychological investigation without my knowledge or consent. I left Uncle Marcus's house with the understanding that my relationship with Sarah was built on systematic deception rather than genuine romantic connection. Her curiosity about me was professional rather than personal, and her intimate knowledge of my psychology had been gathered for research purposes that I hadn't been informed about. But the most disturbing realization was that Uncle Marcus, whose professional and personal role in my life should have protected me from such exploitation, had instead enabled and encouraged it. The therapeutic relationship I'd trusted since adolescence had been compromised by his willingness to treat me as a valuable research specimen rather than a vulnerable individual deserving of protection. The drive home provided time to process the implications of what I'd learned. Sarah's systematic approach to our relationship, her comprehensive documentation of my behavioral patterns, and her sophisticated understanding of my psychological vulnerabilities all made sense within the framework of academic research rather than romantic partnership. I was living with someone who was studying me rather than loving me, whose intimate knowledge of my psychology served professional rather than personal purposes, and whose long-term interest in maintaining our relationship was academic rather than emotional. The realization that I'd been deceived so thoroughly by someone I trusted completely was devastating enough. But the knowledge that my uncle had facilitated this deception made the betrayal exponentially more painful and complex. I returned to my apartment knowing that confronting Sarah would require careful strategy. She was clearly skilled at manipulation and psychological assessment, and her research objectives might include studying my responses to discovering her true purposes. Any confrontation would need to account for the possibility that my reactions were themselves being documented and analyzed. The unraveling the evidence I needed was hidden in plain sight, scattered throughout Sarah's belongings like pieces of a puzzle I'd been too trusting to assemble. Her laptop, which she'd never explicitly forbidden me from using, contained files that revealed the true scope and purpose of her research. What I discovered there shattered any remaining illusions about our relationship's authenticity. The primary folder was labeled Case Study DS-47, with subfolders organized by categories that reduced my entire psychological profile to academic data points: attachment patterns, trauma responses, behavioral modification, environmental manipulation, and termination protocols. Each subfolder contained months of meticulous documentation about every aspect of our relationship. The attachment patterns folder revealed Sarah's systematic analysis of my emotional dependencies and relationship needs. She documented my responses to various forms of attention and withdrawal, mapping my psychological reactions to different levels of intimacy and availability. The files read like clinical assessments, describing my behavior in detached professional terminology that stripped away any humanity from our interactions. Her documentation of my trauma responses was particularly devastating. Sarah had deliberately triggered situations that would activate my childhood trauma reactions, then carefully observed and recorded my coping mechanisms, emotional regulation strategies, and recovery patterns. She'd systematically exploited my most vulnerable psychological areas for research purposes. The behavioral modification folder contained detailed records of experiments Sarah had conducted to influence my choices, preferences, and daily routines. She documented which techniques were most effective for changing my behavior, how long modifications took to implement, and which approaches produced the most sustainable results. I was her laboratory rat, and she'd been running carefully controlled experiments on my psychology for months. Most disturbing was the environmental manipulation folder, which detailed how Sarah had systematically altered my social environment, living space, and daily routine to create conditions that would enhance her research objectives. She'd introduced specific people into my life, suggested changes to my apartment organization, and influenced my social activities to create optimal circumstances for studying my behavioral patterns. But the termination protocols folder was what finally confirmed my worst fears about Sarah's long-term intentions. The documents outlined strategies for ending our relationship in ways that would provide maximum research value while minimizing potential complications for her academic career. Sarah had been planning our breakup from the beginning, timing it to coincide with her dissertation defense and academic job applications. The termination timeline suggested that our relationship was approaching its predetermined conclusion. Sarah had gathered sufficient data for her research purposes, and maintaining the deception was becoming more resource-intensive than academically valuable. The protocols included strategies for managing my emotional response to the breakup, minimizing potential exposure of her research methods, and ensuring that I wouldn't interfere with her academic advancement. Among the files, I found correspondence with academic advisors, research consultants, and ethics review committees that revealed the institutional support Sarah had received for her unauthorized psychological research. Multiple professors and graduate programs had been aware of her methodology, providing guidance and resources while apparently ignoring the ethical violations inherent in studying unwitting human subjects. Uncle Marcus appeared frequently in these communications, serving as both consultant and facilitator for Sarah's research. His psychological profile of me, complete with diagnostic assessments and therapeutic history, had been shared with Sarah's academic advisors as part of establishing my suitability as a research subject. My most private psychological information had been distributed among academic professionals without my knowledge or consent. The correspondence also revealed that I wasn't Sarah's first long-term research subject. She'd conducted similar studies with previous romantic partners, developing increasingly sophisticated methodologies for psychological manipulation and behavioral analysis. Her academic career was built on a foundation of intimate betrayals, each relationship serving as a stepping stone toward greater professional recognition. The email threads included discussions about publication strategies, conference presentations, and job applications that would feature her research on unwitting subjects. Sarah planned to build her entire academic career on studies conducted without informed consent, using intimate relationships as cover for psychological experimentation. Most horrifying was the discovery that her research had attracted attention from corporations and government agencies interested in advanced manipulation techniques. Sarah's methodology for creating emotional dependency, modifying behavior, and maintaining long-term psychological control had applications beyond academic psychology, and she'd been in discussions about consulting opportunities that would monetize her expertise in human manipulation. The financial incentives were substantial. Sarah stood to gain not only academic recognition, but significant consulting income from organizations seeking to apply her techniques for marketing, political influence, and social control. Her research on me was valuable intellectual property that would fund her career for years to come. I spent hours reviewing the documentation, each file revealing new layers of betrayal and manipulation that I'd been too naive to recognize. Sarah's systematic approach to our relationship hadn't been thorough romantic devotion. It had been comprehensive psychological research conducted with scientific rigor and complete ethical disregard. The physical evidence in her apartment confirmed what the digital files suggested. Sarah maintained detailed observation notes, photographic documentation, and even audio recordings of our private conversations. She'd been creating a multimedia archive of our relationship for academic analysis and professional presentation. Her personal journal, which I'd previously respected as private writing, actually contained clinical assessments of my psychological state, behavioral predictions, and experimental hypotheses about my responses to various manipulations. Every intimate moment we'd shared had been filtered through Sarah's analytical perspective and reduced to data points supporting her research conclusions. The most painful discovery was a series of photographs that mirrored those I'd found in Uncle Marcus's study. Sarah had been documenting my appearance, expressions, and behavioral characteristics in ways that suggested I was part of a larger pattern or type that both she and my uncle found academically interesting. The photographs felt like evidence in a criminal investigation, reducing me to visual data rather than acknowledging my humanity. I realized that Sarah's curiosity about me had never been personal attraction or romantic interest. I represented a psychological profile that made me valuable as a research subject. Childhood trauma creating specific attachment vulnerabilities, social isolation making me susceptible to manipulation, and intellectual capacity making my responses to various stimuli more complex and therefore academically interesting. The systematic nature of her deception was overwhelming in its comprehensiveness. Sarah had constructed an entirely false relationship designed to facilitate her research objectives while maintaining my compliance and emotional investment. Every aspect of our connection had been calculated to serve her academic advancement at the expense of my psychological well-being and personal autonomy. As I prepared to confront Sarah with evidence of her research, I realized that even this confrontation was probably anticipated in her termination protocols. She'd likely prepared strategies for managing my discovery of her true purposes, including techniques for minimizing emotional damage to herself while maximizing research value from my responses to betrayal. The woman I loved and trusted completely had never existed. Sarah, the curious, analytical, intellectually passionate graduate student, was a carefully constructed persona designed to facilitate psychological manipulation. The real Sarah was a researcher who viewed intimate relationships as opportunities for academic exploitation, human emotions as data to be collected, and other people's psychological vulnerabilities as resources to be mined for professional advancement. I sat in her apartment, surrounded by evidence of my own systematic exploitation, preparing for a confrontation that would probably serve her research objectives even as it ended our relationship. The irony wasn't lost on me that my emotional devastation at discovering her betrayal would likely become the final data point in her comprehensive study of my psychological profile. The confrontation Sarah returned to her apartment that evening to find me sitting at her desk, surrounded by the evidence of her systematic deception. The printed emails, research files, and photographic documentation were arranged with deliberate precision, creating a comprehensive display of her academic betrayal that would be impossible to deny or rationalize away. Her initial reaction was telling in its calculation rather than surprise. Sarah assessed the situation with the same analytical approach she'd applied to every aspect of our relationship, quickly cataloging what I'd discovered and formulating her response strategy. There was no shame, no apparent regret, only professional evaluation of a research complication that required careful management. "I see you've been conducting your own investigation," she said with calm observation, as if my discovery of her deception was simply another interesting behavioral response to be documented and analyzed. Her lack of emotional reaction was perhaps more devastating than anger or defensiveness would have been. Sarah approached my confrontation with the same clinical detachment she'd maintained throughout our relationship, treating my pain as additional data rather than recognizing the human cost of her research methods. "Did you ever feel anything genuine for me?" I asked, needing to understand whether any aspect of our relationship had transcended her academic objectives. Sarah considered the question with thoughtful precision, apparently weighing the research value of honesty versus continued manipulation. "I found you intellectually fascinating," she replied with careful accuracy. "Your psychological profile presented unique research opportunities that exceeded my initial expectations. The emotional responses you generated in me were professionally satisfying rather than personally meaningful." Her clinical honesty was more brutal than any emotional outburst could have been. Sarah had reduced our entire relationship to professional satisfaction derived from successful manipulation of a particularly interesting research subject. I had been a psychological puzzle that provided career advancement rather than a human being deserving of authentic connection. "How long have you been planning to end this?" I asked, gesturing toward the termination protocols that outlined strategies for our eventual breakup. From the beginning, Sarah admitted without apparent concern for how this revelation might affect me. Long-term relationship studies require predetermined termination points to be academically valuable. Maintaining the research relationship indefinitely would compromise the data quality and serve no legitimate academic purpose. Her matter-of-fact acknowledgement that our relationship had been designed with a planned expiration date revealed the extent of her deception. Every moment of apparent intimacy, every expression of future planning, every gesture of emotional commitment had been performed with full knowledge that the relationship would end according to her research timeline rather than natural development. "What about the other subjects?" I asked, needing to quantify the damage. "How many people have you manipulated for your research?" Sarah's response carried professional pride, not remorse. "5 long-term subjects, counting you. Each case refined my approach. You were the most complex. The depth of your trauma created multi-layered responses. It's been the most valuable study to date." I stared at her, numb. My voice was thin, distant. "You used my pain to get a job." She didn't flinch. "I used your patterns to build a framework. You were always more than a subject, Daniel. You were a catalyst. Your responses helped clarify a whole model of adaptive behavior." Something inside me fractured. The rational part of my mind wanted to scream, wanted to list the violations, the psychological scars, the sheer magnitude of betrayal. But another part, the broken one, the studied one, just went quiet. I rose from her desk, leaving behind the folders and files, the documented proof of every stolen secret. I should report you. You can't, Sarah said softly. But the ethics board already signed off on a retroactive protocol. Your uncle submitted it. Afterward, I turned, disbelief twisting through me. He covered for you. He believed in the research. He said it was too valuable to ignore. There it was. The last betrayal. The man who'd raised me, healed me, molded me, had signed away my trust like a dotted line waiver. I stood by the door, suddenly weightless, like gravity had decided I wasn't real enough to matter anymore. Sarah's eyes followed me, not with love or sorrow, but with quiet satisfaction. One final observation. I'll be citing this case under a different name, she added. The anonymization will be thorough. No one will ever know it was you. That was her mercy, her courtesy. I didn't say goodbye. There was no language left that could express the scale of what she'd taken. 3 months passed. I didn't tell anyone, not officially. I didn't publish a takedown, or sue, or beg Uncle Marcus for answers. Instead, I disappeared into what Sarah might have called control group behavior, isolation, introspection, abandonment of the experiment. But I wasn't done. I tracked down subject number 2. Her name was Lena. She was a composite figure in Sarah's notes, high emotional intelligence, low resistance to attachment conditioning. The real Lena was living in Colorado under a different last name. When I contacted her, she hesitated only a moment before replying. I thought I was crazy. I thought she loved me. She wasn't the only one. I met subject number 4 in Boston. A man. Older. Former professor. He poured whiskey into coffee and said she didn't need drugs. She was the drug. She knew how to get inside you and make herself indispensable. He'd lost tenure after their breakup. Said he'd been too ashamed to talk about it until now. Together, we started a file. Not for publication. Not for revenge. For truth. Sarah's name began appearing on panels and symposium schedules. Her dissertation won awards. She was being courted by think tanks and private sector behavior firms. She smiled in press photos with the same gentle detachment she once gave me after sex. I watched, not as a victim anymore, but as something else. An observer. One day, she'll see my name on an ethics paper, or a case study about methodological malpractice. She'll recognize the terminology, the patterns, the phrasing she once used. She'll know. I was never just a subject. I was the anomaly she failed to account for. And in the end, I wrote her back into the experiment.